And this time I want to talk about the total collapse of the American and Israeli military strategy in the Middle East as we sit here in August of 2026. And what I'd like to argue here is that it is time for the United States, and particularly the administration in Washington, to face a harsh geographical and mathematical reality. The strategy to contain the Iranian axis has failed. The regional ceasefire arrangements are actively disintegrating, and we are fundamentally losing this multi-front war. And the way I'd like to proceed is I'd first like to talk about the goals that the United States and Israel set out to achieve following the June ceasefire, specifically regarding the northern border of Israel and the Lebanese theater. And then I'd like to talk about our complete failure to achieve any of those goals. And I'd like to describe how badly off we are today, right now, as the illusion of security completely shatters. And then I want to switch and talk about the fundamental military strategies that we have employed in pursuit of those goals, and why those strategies were inherently flawed from the moment they were drafted. And you want to keep in mind here that what I am going to be constantly doing is talking about the relationship between the political objectives we are pursuing and the military reality on the ground that prevents us from achieving them. But let's start with the goals in the Levant. When the June ceasefire went into effect, the United States and the Israelis had a very specific set of objectives regarding Lebanon. The first goal was to permanently decouple the Lebanese front from the broader Iranian conflict. The second goal, and this was the absolute numero uno objective for the government in Jerusalem, was to push Hezbollah forces north of the Litani River and establish a permanent secure buffer zone in southern Lebanon. The entire premise was that by creating the so-called pilot zones where the Lebanese army would supposedly assume control, the tens of thousands of evacuated Israeli citizens could finally safely return to their homes in the north. That was the political objective, and the assumption was that U.S.-led diplomacy could reshape the security architecture of the region without requiring Israel to wage a perpetual, full-scale ground war of occupation. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, where are we today in early August in terms of those specific goals? And let me make two different sets of arguments here. First of all, just looking at the facts on the ground this week, we have achieved none of those goals. None of them have been achieved, and there is absolutely no evidence that any of them are going to be achieved anytime soon. Today, as we speak, the Israeli military has officially resumed what they call precise strikes in southern Lebanon, publicly citing blatant violations of the ceasefire by Hezbollah. The Israeli Defense Forces have launched devastating airstrikes, including a highly destructive bombing on a cemetery in the town of Tebnine, which has become one of the deadliest strikes since the June truce began. Furthermore, the IDF has reissued displacement and evacuation orders for Lebanese towns like Mansouri, giving residents just 30 minutes to flee. We have not seen these kinds of mass displacement orders since the height of the spring offensive, when over 1 million people were displaced. Families are fleeing once again, and in return, the cost in Israeli blood continues to mount. Just yesterday, 2 Israeli soldiers were killed and multiple others wounded by explosions in South Lebanon, highlighting the lethal reality of booby-trapped vehicles and complex minefields laid by Hezbollah. The strategy of creating secure pilot zones has fundamentally failed. Progress in these zones is essentially non-existent. The Lebanese government is demanding a quicker Israeli withdrawal, and Israel, trapped by its own security imperatives, is refusing to leave. Instead, Israel has effectively occupied swathes of southern Lebanon, conducting mass demolitions of infrastructure. They are using hundreds of tons of explosives to flatten areas, such as the massive detonations we just saw around Beaufort Castle. This is not what a successful security strategy looks like. This is the definition of a strategic quagmire. The border is once again an active combat zone, and the citizens of northern Israel remain displaced. To take this a step further, the United States is currently leading the 7th round of de-escalation talks in Rome between Israeli and Lebanese delegations. These talks are reportedly focusing on areas like Ali Tahar, where the detonations are occurring. But this is diplomatic theater. The negotiations in Rome are fundamentally disconnected from the battlefield. You cannot negotiate effectively from a position where your adversary knows you cannot achieve your military objectives on the ground. Hezbollah understands that Israel is bogged down. They understand that the IDF is stretched incredibly thin across multiple fronts, and therefore the diplomatic coercion being attempted by Washington in Rome is completely toothless. The Western assumption is that Hezbollah wants to de-escalate on American terms, but Hezbollah's leadership views these talks as an attempt to extract concessions that Israel could not win through force of arms. So in terms of the goals we went into this ceasefire with regarding Lebanon, we failed to achieve them, and we ended up much worse off after the fighting resumed. Now the question you have to ask yourself is, what happened here? Why did the broader military strategies fail? What I'd like to do is frame the discussion in terms of the overarching military strategies that the United States and its allies tried to use to manage this multi-front war, and why those strategies have collapsed so spectacularly by August 2026. And the question you want to ask yourself is, what were those strategies, and why did they fail to bring Iran and its proxy network to heel? I'm going to argue that the United States basically had 5 potential strategies it could pursue. 3 involving air power, 1 involving naval power, and 1 involving a massive land invasion. The United States quite rationally chose not to pursue a full-scale land invasion of Iran, recognizing the geographic and logistical nightmare that would entail. Instead, Washington relied heavily on a combination of discriminate air campaigns, targeting military infrastructure while largely avoiding massive civilian population centers, and a naval blockade to exert maximum economic pressure. But as we sit here today, the profound reality is that the United States has exhausted its capacity to project power through these methods. And this brings me to the single most critical failure of the war, which I call the interceptor miscalculation. When the war started back in February, the Pentagon assumed it could fight a defensive war of attrition indefinitely. They believed they could rely on overwhelming technological superiority to shoot down incoming threats while selectively punishing the adversary from the air. But we completely forgot a fundamental law of military economics. A multi-million-dollar American interceptor missile, like a Patriot or a THAAD, is vastly harder, slower, and exponentially more expensive to replace than a mass-produced, low-cost Iranian drone or ballistic missile. Over the past 5 months of continuous multi-front warfare, the United States has spent its inventory down to the bone. We have effectively disarmed ourselves of our most advanced defensive and offensive options simply by trying to maintain the status quo. This is not a theoretical problem discussed in academic seminars. This is a severe breaking crisis at the absolute highest levels of the American government. Just last week, President Trump confronted Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth at Camp David in a highly contentious meeting. The primary issue on the table was extreme munitions shortages. The United States is currently facing a critical, paralyzing deficit in long-range guided missiles and advanced air defense interceptors. The president was reportedly furious that he had not been properly informed about how rapidly our stockpiles were being depleted by this daily war of attrition. But the mathematics of the defense industrial base are undeniable. You cannot sustain a high-intensity, multi-front air war spanning from the Levant to the Persian Gulf without the industrial capacity to mass-produce precision munitions at a wartime pace. Our defense contractors simply cannot build them fast enough. Because of this severe shortage, the administration was quite literally forced to pull back from launching additional massive strikes against Iranian targets in recent days. Think about the profound strategic implications of that reality. The United States of America, the preeminent military power on the planet, is having its strategic options dictated not by policy choices or grand strategy, but by empty arsenals. We do not have the missiles required to execute a sustained, indiscriminate air campaign, even if we wanted to, and we lack the interceptors to effectively defend our regional bases from the inevitable massive retaliation. This fundamentally destroys the entire concept of deterrence. Deterrence relies on the adversary believing that you possess both the absolute will and the physical capability to inflict unacceptable damage. When the Iranians realize that Washington is rationing its long-range missiles, the threat of an overwhelming American strike entirely loses its coercive power. This munition crisis completely unravels the strategy of diplomatic coercion that the United States has relied upon. When you are attempting to dictate terms to Tehran, or trying to force Hezbollah to retreat in Lebanon, your diplomats are entirely reliant on the implicit threat of American military force. But when the Pentagon is internally sounding the alarm that it cannot sustain another major exchange of fire, that diplomatic leverage evaporates. This is exactly why the Discriminate Air campaign failed. We tried to use precise, limited strikes to send political messages, but we ended up burning through our high-end munitions while the adversary simply absorbed the blows, dispersed their assets, and kept building cheap drones. We played into a war of attrition that heavily favored the industrial realities and risk tolerance of the weaker power. So when you look at the military strategies we actually employed, they were fundamentally mismatched with our industrial base and the realities of modern symmetric warfare. The United States went into a protracted conflict, assuming a quick, decisive technological victory, and instead found itself dragged into a grinding war of logistics that it was economically and industrially unprepared to fight. And as we will see, this exhaustion of American military power has had catastrophic consequences, not just on the battlefields of Lebanon, but in the most strategically vital waterway on Earth. The failure of our air and naval strategies paved the way for a geopolitical disaster in the Persian Gulf, one that fundamentally alters the global balance of power and threatens the entire international economic system. And that brings me to the third and perhaps most devastating consequence of our failed strategies, the catastrophic situation in the Strait of Hormuz. You have to remember that when the United States implemented its naval blockade earlier this year, the overarching goal was to completely choke off the Iranian economy, force the regime to capitulate on its nuclear and proxy network ambitions, and secure the free flow of global commerce entirely on Western terms. But instead of surrendering, Iran did exactly what realist theory predicts a rational state will do when its fundamental survival is threatened. It escalated horizontally. Iran utilized its massive geographic advantage to shut off traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, effectively holding 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply hostage. The United States assumed its naval dominance would quickly break this stranglehold, but as our munition stockpiles dwindled and our regional alliances began to fracture under the pressure, the reality of the balance of power began to assert itself. Today, we are witnessing a diplomatic masterstroke by Tehran that effectively hands them permanent leverage over the global economy. As we speak, Iran and Oman are finalizing a bilateral agreement regarding the geographic coordinates for a new commercial shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian diplomats have publicly announced that the exact geographic coordinates of the route have been agreed upon, and they are merely waiting for final approval from Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But you have to look closely at the fine print of this arrangement. The new route is designed in such a way that commercial ships will be forced to pass directly through Iranian territorial waters, both on the inbound and outbound legs of their journey. This is a monumental historic shift. Under this agreement, Tehran will have de jure and de facto control over the vessels entering and exiting the world's most critical energy choke point. How did this happen? How did the United States allow its primary regional adversary to gain legal and geographical control over the strait? It happened because the American military umbrella entirely failed to protect our regional allies. In the weeks leading up to this agreement, Iran issued a blunt, unmistakable warning to the Gulf states. If the United States uses your airspace or your military bases to launch any new attacks on Iranian territory, Iran will immediately retaliate by destroying critical energy infrastructure across the entire region. The Gulf states, acting in their own rational self-interest and seeing clearly that the U.S. was running out of interceptor missiles, panicked. They realized Washington could not protect their vulnerable refineries and oil fields from a massive, coordinated Iranian missile and drone swarm. Therefore, Oman bypassed Washington entirely and cut a deal directly with Tehran to keep the oil flowing, cutting the United States out of the equation. The United States has been completely outmaneuvered on the diplomatic chessboard. To add to the pressure, the Houthi maritime blockade remains entirely active. Just yesterday, they successfully targeted 2 Saudi oil tankers, including the Wafa, off the coast of Yanbu, in a desperate attempt to facilitate the Hormuz negotiations and avoid a global economic depression caused by skyrocketing energy prices. The U.S. Treasury Department just this week quietly removed counterterrorism sanctions from multiple aircraft and airlines directly linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. We are actively making unilateral concessions while Iran aggressively redraws the map of the Persian Gulf. So if you look at the agreements being crafted right now, the United States is effectively conceding on the key strategic issues. We failed to break the blockade through naval power, and we are now being forced to accept an arrangement where Iran dictates the terms of global maritime navigation. To conclude, if you step back and look at the totality of this conflict since it escalated in February, the United States set out to achieve absolute deterrence, decouple the regional proxy fronts, secure northern Israel, and maintain hegemony over Middle Eastern shipping lanes. We have failed to achieve any of those goals. In Lebanon, the ceasefire is a complete fiction. The pilot zones have collapsed, and Israel is taking casualties while bombing cemeteries in towns like Tebnine. In Washington, the administration is paralyzed by an extreme shortage of precision munitions, physically unable to launch the massive strikes it threatens. And in the Persian Gulf, Iran is actively consolidating its control over the Strait of Hormuz, utilizing the very geopolitical leverage we tried to strip away from them. This is exactly what strategic defeat looks like. It does not always mean enemy armies marching on your capital. It means a total inability to translate military power into your desired political objectives. The different strategies that we have employed over the last 5 months, from discriminate air campaigns to naval blockades, have definitively failed. The only rational path forward for the United States is to finally settle this war, to recognize the geographic and industrial limitations of our current military posture, and to accept that the balance of power in the Middle East has fundamentally shifted. Continuing to pursue maximalist goals with an empty arsenal is a recipe for a global catastrophe, and it is time for the administration to face the reality of the board.